your data into your database tables, at this point you need to start asking your database to answer some questions. So for instance, we are looking at my database, my university database. So the university database has three tables: enrollment, offering, and student. The enrollment table is an associative entity between the two other tables, parent tables. So if we look at relationships, you can see that. So now what I need to do is I need to be able to ask the database, for instance, tell me all the students that are in a particular offering, right? So how are we going to do that? So if we close the relationships window, we're going to open up the query window. So I go back to the Create tab. On the Create tab, we click on Query Design. And in Query Design, we have the Show Table dialog box. Now in Chapter 6, you've learned how to close this right away. For the purposes of your project, you're going to use the GUI tool. The reason for that is because the SQL in Chapter 6 does not cover the syntax for an SQL statement to actually join tables together. So we need to use the GUI tool. So for instance, I'm going to double click because that's my favorite way of moving tables into the query. So I'm going to bring in the student table, I'm going to bring in the enrollment table, and I'm going to bring in the offering table. At that point, those are all the tables that are involved in this query, because in order for me to get data about a student that's in an offering, I need the enrollment table, because the enrollment table has the foreign keys. So that's actually the table that's telling me what student took what offering. Okay, so once I have those tables, and again, if you have, this is usually the part where most students run into issues, setting up the queries. So when it comes to setting up the queries, I expect you to be sending me questions via email. But I'm going to show you how to do this using the GUI tool, how to use the GUI tool. So we'll close the show table, and now we have our three tables. I like to move them around and then stretch them out a little bit just so I can see all of the columns. So if I just open up the enrollment table, right, if I double click on it, all this table shows me are numbers and letters. It's not a lot of information, but it holds the key values. The key values are what allow me to get to the actual entity data. So if I close the enrollment table, if I want to ask a question such as, show me all the students, right? So I want the student ID, I want the first name, and I want the last name. And just so you can see what's going on, I'm going to bring in the student ID and the offering ID from the enrollment table. And then I'm going to bring in the course, the offer term, and the offering year. And I also want to bring in the offering ID. So how am I doing this? You know, you're hearing a lot of clicking and there are fields popping up on the bottom. So if you go up to these tables in the query designer and you double click any of them, they automatically pop down on the bottom. Okay, and they will go in order, and as you double click, it'll pop them onto the field list to the right. If, however, you decide that you are missing a column, so for instance, I took all of the columns out of the offering table except for the including the offering ID. If I wanted the offering ID to appear to the left of course, then what I can do is I can actually click and drag that down, and as long as I'm hovering over the course column, when I let go, it pops it in there. That might take some practice to get used to doing that. Or I can click, now there's a little gray line. See, I have offering ID highlighted. There's a thin gray line just above that. If you hover your cursor right over that, it will turn into a bolded down arrow. And when it's a bolded down arrow, you can click on it, and that selects that column. And then you can remove it. Well, I don't want to remove that offering ID. I want to remove the offering ID that's at the end. So I'm gonna click to highlight that. I'm gonna hit delete on my keyboard, and it goes away. I can also click and drag. So for instance, if I did want offering to appear at the end, I can highlight the offering ID, again by clicking that little gray bar above it, clicking and dragging it. And as I drag to the side, you see that bolded line that's appearing. That means wherever I stop and let go, that's where that column will appear. So then I want to do it again. I want to click on that and move it back over to the left of course and let go, and that's where it's going to appear. So what this query is going to do is this query is going to show me all of the students and the courses that they're enrolled in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run this, and here's the data sheet. Now this is information. This, when I look at the enrollment table, that's data. The offering table, that's data. Student is data. Okay? When I actually run a query, now this is information. This is telling me I've got 2 students. It gives me their name, and then it tells me what courses they're enrolled in. This is information. This is useful. I can use this for something. So for instance, the reason I left the columns in there. So first of all, how do I make these columns fit? So it works just like Microsoft Excel. You should be familiar with Excel. If you double click on in between the columns, they will auto fit themselves. And I'm going to do that for all of them so that you can see what columns I am working with. Yeah, and again, remember, this is an abbreviated database. I'm trying to use a little bit of data so I can communicate this quickly. I'm trying to keep these videos fairly short. So I can see all of my I can see my students, I can see their enrollments. So the 2 columns in the middle, these 2, and how did I highlight those? I clicked on the column header, which is enrollment.studentID, and then when I clicked on that, I dragged over to the enrollment.offering ID. What that's doing is that's what's called fully qualifying, because I'm using the student ID from the student table and the student ID from the enrollment table. So in order for the database to let me know which is which, it actually does that enrollment dot and student dot notation to let me know what tables those are coming from. So just so you can see how they join up, right? We know that student ID 1 was enrolled in offering ID 1. And then when we use the associative entity, now I can see that Michael Devlin is registered into IT 117 for the fall 2011 term. I can see that Mary Smith, student ID 2, because she's enrolled in offering 1, also joins up with offering 1, IT 117, fall 2011. Now this data is duplicated, but it's only duplicated in RAM memory. This is a dynamic table. Remember how queries work. Queries are a dynamic table, so this is displaying data temporarily in memory. So now this is a valid query. I could save this. So if I click save, I can save this as student enrollments, something along those lines, right? So that's nice. So now let me change this. Let me go back to the design view. So now I'm not going to SQL view. I'm going back to graphical design view, which is this. So now I say to myself, you know what? I want to see things in a particular order, right? Remember the order by clause. So the way I can do that is the third row down. So the first row is the fields, right? So those are the different fields. The second row tells you what table those fields are from. There is then a sort row. So I want this displayed in last name, first name order. So I'm going to click ascending under first name, and I'm going to click ascending under last name. And then I'm going to run this. And then what you see is I am ordering this by first name, then last name. And that's not exactly how I want this displayed. I want this displayed last name, first name order. And the reason for that is this graphical interface will sort only from left to right. So we can do one of two things. I can click to select the last name column and then click and move it over to the left of first name. And now when I run this, now it runs in the right order. Hope you understand that. So it's just a matter of where they appear at the bottom is how you sort them. And then, for instance, maybe I want to put in a where clause, right? So we have where, we have criteria. I don't want all records to appear, and I use a where clause by using the criteria. So if you see, there's a show button, a show row, with checkboxes in it, and then underneath that is criteria. So if I only want to see information associated with student ID 1, I can put a 1 there and then run this, and that will only show me student ID 1. If instead I get rid of that and then I go over to course and I put in IT 117 and I run that, I'm going to see the students associated with IT 117. Right, so these are questions that I'm asking the database. If I go in, I can say, all right, bring in the grade. Right, so the one thing that I don't have here from the enrollment table is the grade. So if I bring down the grade, I'm going to click and drag, and I'm going to drop it over offering ID from the offering table. Bloop. And then it just appears there. Now I want to see anybody who's gotten greater than a B. So if I put greater than B, okay, now I'm getting anybody who's gotten higher than a B in IT 117. So when I run that, it shows me no one. Could have sworn people got better grades than that. Let me look at the enrollment table. It doesn't like the way I'm doing that. Okay. All right. Isn't that funny? Anyway. So, we can put term in. So then you see that there are all rows. So when things are ANDed, in chapter 6 we talk about things being ANDed. So if I want to see student ID 1 and any student that's taking IT 117, when I run that, I only get student ID 1 and IT 117. If, however, I want to go the other way, I can do an OR. So I can delete that out of there, and I can go down a row, and I can put a 1 in there. So now I get either your student ID 1, so I get all records associated with student ID 1, or you're taking course IT 117. See how that works? Okay, you can continue down, right? So I can put in the 2. So on another OR row, so now I'm going to get any student whose ID is 2, I'm going to get any student whose ID is 1, and I'm going to get any student that's taking IT 117. So now when I run this, I get everybody back, as far as the data that I've put in so far. All right, so that's using ORs, that's using ANDs. You can use aliases in here. When you want to set up an alias in here, I wouldn't bother doing aliasing, but what I'm going to expect you to do is I'm going to expect you for the project to create a number of queries based on the data that you have to answer some questions. So you have to ask your database some questions using queries. And if again, this is probably the most difficult part of the project, so communicate with me and I will help you create queries for your database. And that will end the video lecture on creating queries for your project.